And we're back, or rather, we're still here. The Pacers set a playoff record for field goal percentage against the New York Knicks. We're done talking about the New York Knicks. We're here to talk about the Boston Celtics. And because this is a fresh round, the Eastern Conference Finals, the first time for the Pacers back in the Eastern Conference Finals in over a decade, I need to be much better on these shows of actually introducing who I'm talking to. So Samson Folk back again. Third round, he's still sticking around with me and being willing and generous with his time and talent to keep discussing this series with me. He's been covering the Pacers for quite some time now. The two of us are going to be previewing this series together. Samson, thoughts about the Pacers advancing to the Eastern Conference Finals?
I have it in meme form. Still here, despite it all. It's a young man playing a bass guitar with a blurry image behind him, just rocking out. It's funny, I was talking to S, and I said, like, yeah, I'll be doing it for like 2 weeks. It will be at least 2 months, I reckon, this coverage, which shocks me. I'm very happy for the people of Indiana and to whoever enjoys taking in the work we provide. A fun little nugget of info. You joked about it before we had started. And I don't mean this in an antagonistic way to people from Boston or Celtics fans. But you had mentioned that when I moved to Toronto, the Raptors started playing quite poorly. And when I started covering the Pacers, things started going quite well. The first season I started writing and podcasting, covering the Raptors, I wasn't in Toronto, but they did win the championship. Just a mention. Magic Johnson type of rookie, I suppose.
I see a lot of synergy here. Obviously, you are the good luck charm for teams when you're not living in the market of the team that you're covering.
And you keep trying to get me out there. What's wrong with you? I like this. That's you can't do that.
Do you remember that I reenacted a GQ photo that is believed to be cursed? I don't run from the smoke, Samson. I don't care about this. I'll bring the talisman to the city.
It's some monkey paws stuff.
Correct.
I get it. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about the Pacers and the Celtics.
Okay, so to preview the five games...
I have a joke. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
The worst second-round team of all time is now in the Eastern Conference Final.
I do not appreciate this joke, but I will carry on. The Pacers and the Celtics played each other 5 times this season, and only one of those games did they play with Pascal Siakam in the lineup. And in the game that Pascal played, Tyrese Haliburton was on a minutes restriction. So at the base level, it may seem as though we don't have much to go off of between these two teams. I come from the other side, and I think that we actually do have quite a bit to go off of because I really enjoyed these 5 games between the Pacers and the Celtics this year, in part because both of them approached them with extra game planning, especially from Boston's perspective. When we started this all out, and I told you, like, Milwaukee did not play those games like playoff games. They played them like regular season games. Several of these games from Boston, especially after they lost in the in-season tournament and came back at the beginning of January, there was a lot of extensive game planning, particularly against Tyrese Haliburton and in the second game in March when Pascal was on board. So I do think that there's some interesting nuggets that we can bring up from, and I will tell you, Samson, that in rewatching these games and when I watched them live the first time, there are moments when I've seen Miles Turner intentionally guard Derek White. I've seen Kristaps Porzingis intentionally guard TJ McConnell. I've seen Drew Holiday intentionally deployed as the 5 with Miles Turner guarding him. I've seen Benedict Mathurin intentionally deployed at the 5 with Luke Cornett guarding him. Things are about to get weird. There's a lot of weird things that are about to happen, and I think it's predominantly most interesting at the center position and how both teams manage, deploy, and react to the 5s. And we should first start out and say, I believe it's been reported that Kristaps Porzingis is expected to be out for the first 2 games of this series, but we'll have to continue to play that by ear. What are your overall thoughts about the center matchup and all the various people who might end up playing the 5?
Yeah, I've kind of said this, and sorry to disappoint listeners, but sometimes I do, subject myself to the mercy of, like, it's in the future. And some things are maybe a bit too cloudy to predict. The center position, how it plays out, especially with Porzingis not factoring in the first couple games, probably. It's almost impossible to predict. I even saw quite a few different things that Boston did against the Raptors this season. I saw, like, Porzingis play the deepest drop I've ever seen in my life. He was in the restricted area, against the Raptors one game, then he wasn't the next game. I saw Porzingis guard Pascal. I saw Drew Holiday guard Pascal. I saw Jason Tatum guard Pascal. I saw Pascal struggle against a couple of those guys. I saw Pascal dominate a couple of those guys. Boston, they have so many good defenders. They just throw it at the wall. And Boston makes it work. They're so sticky. They make it make sense. They're so talented on that end defensively. I never really have any qualms or problems with expectations for the Celtics to get stops. It's more so the adaptability of the offense to keep them going, not subject themselves to droughts and stuff like that. I have no idea how the 5 is going to shake out.
Would you allow me to take you on a journey from the game at the end of January when Pascal was available and show you that in many respects, the entire Bucks series played out in that one game against Boston by the end of the game? So let me throw this up here.
Mm-hmm.
The first half running pick and pop between Tyrese Haliburton and Miles Turner. Porzingis playing in a drop. Tyrese shovel passes it back to Miles. Miles makes that 3. The very next possession, same exact play again. Tyrese pulls a pullback Rondo move in the building where Rondo pulled back many times on the floor of TD Garden. Kristaps Porzingis reacts, starts to lunge at Miles Turner. That gives Tyrese a wide open layup. After this, Joe Mazzulla called a timeout. Out of the timeout, they end up putting Porzingis on Pascal Siakam. The Pacers go to stack pick and roll. At this point in time, Buddy Hield was still on the Pacers. He was starting for the Pacers. So he's the stack screener, and a wrinkle that I had never seen them run before is he leaks out of that stack screen and sets an inverted ball screen, touch screen for Siakam in the corner. Siakam then attacks Kristaps Porzingis and gets to the rim. There were many possessions where Pascal really punished that cross match in a variety of different ways, where here he's going to use the retreat dribble, pull back, and charge ahead at the 5 spot, drive and kick to Aaron Nesmith at the top of the key for the little midi pull-up too, which he hit at an incredibly high rate in Game 7 against the New York Knicks.
That rocked.
Pascal Siakam knocks down an above the break 3 against Kristaps Porzingis, and then by the end of the game, he's even creating separation and shooting over the top of Porzingis's 7'3" standing reach. So when they get to the end of this game, you will notice that they did, as Doc Rivers and the Milwaukee Bucks did, ended up eventually putting Porzingis onto Aaron Nesmith because he had had enough of the Pascal Siakam matchup, and then they do a lot of off-ball switching with Porzingis just trying to play low and scram out mismatches, and this ended up being a pretty tight game despite the fact that the Pacers gave up 81 points, I believe, in the first half, and then they ended up making it a game, but by the fourth quarter, Tyrese wasn't able to play because he was on a minutes restriction. But those are the ways that they moved Porzingis around, and I imagine that some of that, whether it's Porzingis or Al Horford, is still going to apply.
I'm expecting lots of this. This previews are interesting because you have to try and, glean so much from a different context. And as you said, you got Milwaukee that you have to be predictive in what's going to change. And the Celtics, you have to be kind of like looking at what might stay the same, which it makes it really interesting. Pascal, to his credit, I think has done a very good job of meeting the moment against the cross matches. And especially as his usage has gone up. We saw it in, Game 7. He missed a couple layups as the game went on, but typically quite good at attacking who was in front of him. I guess Brian Windhorst had a report where he said Pascal was was worried about going against OG in Game 7 because he thought he was injured. Interesting report that just came out. I do wonder how it looks because Pascal is like a really good litmus test for the adaptability of how the Pacers attack things, and moving him around and using him as a fulcrum to attack different looks is exactly what he was brought in there for. I want to see the efficacy of it all.
I think
he had a good game though, right? Against the Celtics that time. Like it was maybe a classic Pascal Indiana regular season game in that it's lower volume, it's pretty efficient, and they ended up losing.
Yeah, because I think the thing that I would point out is that Boston started the game with Drew Holiday guarding Pascal, and Drew held up on that matchup. The reason they moved it is because Porzingis wasn't holding up against the Tyrese Turner pick and roll and pick and pop. And you can debate how much they needed to react to that. Certainly Miles has had big games against Boston. Typically Boston's like, we're not going to react to Miles in the pick and pop. Sometimes that means Miles is going to make 7 threes against you. And once he had made enough, they ended up switching that matchup. And then once Drew was no longer on Pascal, Pascal did what he did until they eventually, as I said, put Porzingis onto Nesmith for the last couple possessions. But the thing that stands out about it is what I expect Boston to do that's different from Milwaukee is I think that they will be very quick to make these adjustments and switch these matchups rapidly within games rather than from game to game. Like, I don't think it's going to be 2 games of what Pascal did to Brook Lopez in games 1 and 2 before Joe Mazzulla comes back in game 3 and is like, okay, well, now we'll put Brook Lopez back onto Miles Turner. These are rapid changes. The Boston Celtics really like to sow indecision with cross matches. Even not that this pertains to this matchup, but when you were talking about the Raptors and the Celtics playing each other, I watched that in-season tournament game, and there was possessions where they deliberately guarded Scotty Barnes with Peyton Pritchard. Just because it makes you have to think. They're always toying with what they're doing, and it makes teams have to think in a different way. Because another thing that they did in that game that I didn't even necessarily touch on is eventually they weren't playing with any bigs because Al Horford wasn't available. So Drew Holiday was basically functioning as the offensive 5-man and screening for Jason Tatum with Miles Turner defending Drew Holiday. At this point in time, I think that they were playing with Pascal out there. Jason Tatum ends up making a pull-up 3 on one possession, and then on another possession, I think he ends up getting past Miles Turner on what would have been this 1-4 flat pick and roll, which Pascal's going to have to be a little bit quicker helping laterally there, and then with Tyrese sinking into Jaylen Brown and having to deal with that crackback rotation. But you could see in both possessions, and something that pertains to the center position as well, is that Miles Turner's going to be in a lot more spots where he might have to defend a matchup like this, and also he might have to switch a lot more than what we've seen in the prior 2 games.
I am left wondering how Miles affects this matchup for sure.
I think it's going to go one of 2 extremes. I think he's either going to be highly impactful or it's going to be hard for the Pacers to play him. It's going to be one or the other. I don't see much of a middle ground here.
Games 4 and 5, let's say 4, 5, 6, they were like huge swings. And then game 7, I thought Turner was quite good.
Yeah.
And JJ, I thought maybe overstepped on the broadcast. He was like, he's been fantastic for a handful of games, which I don't necessarily agree with. But in game 7, Turner really changed kind of the geometry of the defense. The Celtics are going to score. Like, Tatum is going to be able to get to a pull-up 3 off of a screen action. He's going to be able to like hang dribble and push past Turner at times. As you said, like that play is more reliant on Pascal stepping up quicker, making that read, and Tyrese kind of making sure that the ball goes out to the corner, not the dunker spot. But yeah, I do wonder how he plays and how he's able to do it. Like, is it 4 games out of the series, 5 games out of the series? That's a huge inflection point that we're looking at.
I mean, especially because Porzingis isn't available for the first 2, in the sense that Boston was willing to go super small on some of these possessions. It's either going to have to be that he's posting and punishing those mismatches, which, although he struggled at times against Josh Hart, he has made strides in that area and he's hitting the threes. Otherwise, like I said, it could be difficult because I'm just envisioning situations where there's going to be more late switching. There's going to be more of him having to switch out on the perimeter. And I don't know that that's something you really want Miles Turner doing a lot of. I've seen it work in certain matchups. In part, this is why, the stuff with he and Pascal, I've been wanting them to switch 4-5 screening action for the majority of the back part of the season because of what Pascal's on-ball screening navigation is. But the Pacers have been reluctant to do that because they don't want to switch Miles out. When they played the Orlando Magic, it went quite well when Miles was switching out against Banchero and Franz Wagner, but neither of them are exactly the caliber of shooters that Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum are. So
Jaylen Brown he's brought himself to a crazy shot making level, especially where he was coming out of Cal, like just crazy. As far as not just the center position, but you expect it to be a little bit more normal, like descending down the matchups? Do you have any expectations there?
Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. First of all, I'm kind of curious to know from you, because I think sometimes maybe people that don't watch a ton of the Celtics tend to think of them as a bit interchangeable, and I think that they attack very differently in how that they move. So when you look at the 2 of them, first of all, how would you just describe them as offensive movers and players? And then who do you think on the Pacers roster, particularly in the starting lineup, obviously, matches up best with both of them?
I like Tatum is more of a flow player, I think. And Brown is more of like give me the ball type of player. It's just, I think in flow, the Celtics are able to give Tatum a lot. But I don't know. I think it's with Tatum, I'd much rather keep Tatum above the break. Whereas, like, I don't know. If we're trying to describe them differently, I think that Tatum is a better playmaker. I think that Jaylen Brown, by the numbers, has been a better off-the-bounce shooter and shot maker, especially outside of the paint. Trying to contain Jaylen Brown can be really tough because sometimes the shot making can just be all too much. Whereas trying to contain Jason Tatum is always good in my mind because he's at his most dangerous when he's like getting steps towards the paint. And if you can get him settling, I think Jason Tatum probably isn't going to give you as many like voluminous jump shooting games as Jaylen Brown might, while still, like, I still think Jason Tatum is a more important player and a better player on offense and defense. But I don't know, describing them differently, I just think Tatum is wholesale a better player, but Jaylen Brown is the kind of guy who, like, in a one-on-one matchup over a 7-game series, he could blow up like 5 or 6 times.
I think that Jaylen is obviously smaller. He doesn't control defenders with his upper body near as well as Jason Tatum does. He gets low and tries to sneak through guys, and he tends to gather the ball down by his knees, which is what leads to some of the turnovers in addition to the whole, like, force Jaylen to dribble with his left, stuff that we've seen in the finals and playoff series before, although he has improved in some of those areas. That's what makes it a little bit easier, like when he turns, that you can poke the ball away from him. Whereas Jason Tatum, I think that he evolves how he moves before and after his dribble. He's much more adept at playing with power and protecting the ball with rip-through moves, and I think that you'll see him gather it up high and down low. And I think that those two differences really need to guide what decisions the Pacers make, because here's some numbers for you. In the 5 games that Jason Tatum has played against the Indiana Pacers, hellacious shot making from Jason Tatum. So his effective field goal percentage in those 5 games is 68%. His shot quality in those games is 48.9%. So he shot almost 20% above his expected effective field goal percentage. So we're talking like the Pacers against the New York Knicks in Game 7. That's the degree of the swing. So I do agree with exactly what you said, though. And what I really liked about what you said is that you would prefer to keep Jason Tatum on the perimeter. Those numbers would say that you don't want to do that. But when you watch through a lot of Tatum shots, it's exactly the word that I said. It was like hellacious shot making. I do think that he's shooting above his level on some of the self-created threes. And I would rather tip my hat to that than allow him to go against smaller matchups in the post. I fear his ability to pivot in either direction or to post either block, because of what I've seen and how often they've had to double those post-ups. I think it's very dangerous to put yourselves into rotation against the Boston Celtics because of how much shooting they have at every position. So I guess based on that information, first of all, if you disagree with me, feel free to disagree. Secondly, which defender do you like on Jason Tatum?
It sounds like you'd rather switch actions with Jason.
I would not rather switch actions with Jason.
Really? If you don't,
I don't want him getting into the post. I'd rather keep him on the perimeter.
Or I guess ball handling actions, you wouldn't want, like, to keep things flat up top, to keep, like, to stay out of rotation.
I mean, yeah, they're going to have to switch in those instances, which is why I said that this could get dicey for Miles, because they're going to have to switch on a lot of those.
I guess it depends who they're calling up for screens. That'll be interesting. But I guess on the lower half, is it Pascal? Is it Nesmith? Who do you want?
I think it has to be Pascal. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think defensively a lot is going to be asked of Pascal in this series, because in the game that they played at the end of January, the Pacers started it out with Pascal and Jaylen Brown and Aaron Nesmith on Jason Tatum. Aaron's been predominantly the person guarding Jason through these 5 games. Jason scored 79.1 points per 100 matchups when guarded by Aaron Nesmith versus 26.9 when guarded by Siakam, which they flipped it after halftime. At the time in that game, I tweeted, I'm like, they're going to have to give heavy consideration to putting Pascal onto Jason Tatum, because Jason already had 23 points at halftime of that game. And it isn't perfect because the reasons I brought up, like, there were times where they used the big come set a screen, Pascal's crunched, and now Miles Turner switched on to Jason Tatum, and it looks a little bit different, but I can show you a couple clips from that game and I'll get your opinion on it. just so you can see the difference in some of the stuff I was saying about him controlling matchups with his upper body and the problems that can cause for Aaron, despite the fact that Aaron is a physical defender. This is a lot of what you were seeing in the first half, where Jason's able to get to the rim and really power down Aaron Nesmith from the outside. This is what you're going to deal with Pascal, though, where he's going to be chasing over the top, and then Miles is having to, try to deal with that on the back end. Eventually, this is why I said there was a lot more game planning from both teams in these two games, because eventually Pascal, the coaching staff, took a timeout. When Pascal came out, they were having Pascal pretty aggressively weak Jason Tatum to his left. That turned into more pocket passes to Kristaps Porzingis, and I didn't mind that. That looked better. But overall, the numbers would tell you Pascal, and while I don't really rely on matchup stats that much for some of the reasons we were talking about in the prior series with, like, oh, well, Jalen's 3-9 against TJ McConnell. Okay, well, that's not telling you what he's doing with screen navigation and who's actually ending up on him in certain spots. I did like that Pascal, because of what I said with Tatum being able to gather low or gather high, on some of the high gathers, it's just a lot better with Pascal being to contest than it is with Aaron Nesmith.
I do, yeah. Weaking seems good, especially I know Porzingis missed that one. I know Porzingis' shot making,
right,
if he's back in the series, whatever it ends up being, has been better. I know the way he's changed the post up for himself has changed the kind of the trajectory of his career as a playoff player, because I remember when the post up was something that ruined Dallas's playoff runs, like his unwillingness to punish post ups.
Imagine Carlisle's surprise when he's playing against a Porzingis who's doing things against his players in the post, rather than having to go to Boban in the middle to make plays out of it with Porzingis in the corner.
It will be very interesting. You and I have not spoken very highly of Pascal's defense in the conversations that we've had. There is one aspect of this series where Pascal will be exercising demons, perhaps, for a long ago but not forgotten bubble series where he just missed a lot of like chippies and stuff like that on one end of the floor. On the other end of the floor, he was unbelievable. He guarded Jason Tatum on like a handful of possessions years ago and was really good in isolation and in screen navigation to some degree. Was unbelievable as a backside rim protector. It's been some years since that happened. I wonder if he can like dig down Eastern Conference Finals, maybe provide a bit more punch on that end. That's a linchpin. That swings games in this series for sure.
And that's why, by comparison to the prior two series when he wasn't really guarding Chris Middleton, and here in this last one where he did show things as a roamer, and when they put him on to Deuce McBride, that shifted things for the Pacers. A lot of times with the Pacers, Pascal hasn't been put on top matchups. I don't really see a lot of other ways around this one, because it's kind of like what I said about Andrew Nembhard and Jalen Brunson. I was like, Nembhard is their best point of attack defender. Brunson gave Nembhard a lot of problems during the regular season. He just doesn't have the link to contest in those situations. There's times where you're watching Aaron Nesmith really battle Jason Tatum. He just doesn't have the link to contest in a lot of these situations because of the type of player that Tatum is, and because he is better at using power and his upper body to control those matchups. And that's why it's going to put even more pressure on Pascal, because if Pascal does have to, even if he's not doing it full time, if he's having to take some possessions against Tatum, and then like looking at those possessions where Drew was playing at the 5, if Miles isn't hanging on the switches, there's potential that Pascal is going to have to be playing minutes at the 5 too. And doing things as a rim protector. Like I'm looking ahead into the crystal ball, and a lot is going to be expected from Pascal Siakam on the defensive end that we haven't seen in the prior two series, or really even that much during the regular season, to be quite frank.
Right. So Nesmith goes to Brown.
Yeah. That's what
Nembhard. Where are you putting Nembhard?
I think you got to put Nembhard on Derek White, because I don't want Tyrese Haliburton guarding at the point of attack. And I think you got to put Tyrese on Drew Holiday. And if Drew Holiday does back downs, you're just going to have to live with it.
Yeah. Interesting. The Celtics are really good. They've got a lot of options.
And the reverse, I would expect that Boston will start with Derek White on Tyrese.
Mm-hmm.
Brown likely on Nesmith. Drew on Pascal. And Horford on Miles.
So can I tell you, I really hope that the attention to detail the Pacers started picking up steam with in the playoffs of working more through Pascal.
Mm-hmm.
you got to go to it. The last game I watched of Pascal as a Raptor, which means that there was attention to detail, which means that there was a lot of post touches. He beat Drew so many times that they brought doubles, then he beat the doubles, then he beat Tatum. And unfortunately, the Celtics had better shot making down the end. But I think that there's a room for them to steal. I think Pascal is still maybe the most efficient scorer out of the post per second spectrum in the playoffs. He was at 1.48 points per possession before Game 7. I hope that they're really mindful about that. And I hope that, like, if Turner is out there too, they still maintain that, they have to be steadfast in looking for those switches. And it comes down to shot making. Pascal and Miles have to make shots against smaller guys. They got to be aggressive. They got to get deep.
And the thing too is that Drew in the game that the Pacers played against the Celtics held up, but it's similar to what I said about Josh Hart. It's difficult to guard Pascal Siakam in the post with an arm bar, and Drew's most likely going to be defending Pascal Siakam in the post with an arm bar. Of course, if you do bring the double, depending upon what Porzingis is doing, one thing that I've really liked when the Celtics have gone to that in certain matchups is that they're bringing a center as the double. So the passes out of those traps get way more air under the ball. The Celtics have a lot more time to recover than in the reverse when you're thinking about it of like, oh, Jason Tatum hunted Tyrese in the post. Like, you're getting a mismatch. Typically, the Pacers are going to double from the post entry passer. That might be like Andrew Nembhard. It's easier for Jason Tatum to pass over the top of those than what might be the case for Pascal trying to pass out of it over the top of a center coming and committing hard to his body.
Yeah. We've seen some of it. We just need to see more of it.
Can I show you one more thing about how weird this could potentially get? Two more things, actually. So, by the end of that game, as I said, Porzingis was guarding Aaron Nesmith. This is not a switch. The Pacers intentionally put Miles Turner onto Derek White because they didn't want him guarding in space with Porzingis as the screener anymore. So as they had done a season ago, typically when the Pacers played the Wizards and Porzingis was at the 5, they would have Aaron Nesmith or Buddy Hield guard Porzingis and live with what Porzingis was going to do in the post so that they would be able to keep Miles Turner low. In this case, you don't want Miles Turner on Jason Tatum. You don't want Miles Turner on Jaylen Brown. You could probably toy with him between Drew Holiday and Derek White, but they ultimately chose Derek White, which meant this was what Miles Turner was doing on the perimeter. This is just the degree of weird that both teams are willing to get, because this happened like 2 or 3 possessions at the end of the game where Miles was guarding Derek White, and then you can see Aaron's trying to play on the high side of the post up, and Buddy actually comes from the blind side and gets that steal. But then on the reverse side of it, what the Celtics have done in the TJ McConnell minutes is they've been very willing to put Porzingis, Luke Cornett, whoever their 5 is, on TJ and just sag way off into the paint, which this was a pretty fun possession because TJ nashes it to his left, which you don't normally see, and then reverses back against him. TJ had a little bit more success on that than you would expect, but this is what I'm getting at with some of those post touches. Like, Miles is really fighting for that, and Porzingis doesn't come double there. But if he does, like, those pass outs become more challenging when you're trying to pass over the top of a 7'4" reach. But just more weirdness. Also, the Celtics very willing to play Drew Holiday in the middle of their 2-1-2 zone, and then they will literally morph between man and zone out of this. So, like, when this is a common set that the Pacers run, it's a special, a very effective special that I tracked 2 years ago that they scored points out of very frequently. And then when TJ breaks the free throw line, they go into man. So they went from zone to man on the same possession, and that's something that people will do against TJ a lot, is they'll either guard him with 5s or they automatically go zone when he comes into the game because he is such an effective driver. So point being is, again, more exaggerated game planning against even just TJ McConnell as a bench player than what TJ saw in a lot of other matchups this season.
I wonder, I love the disguised flair to beat zones. It's like, teams, it's so common in attacking zones, but it kind of hangs around for that reason. But yeah.
Actually, let me hop in right there and say that set is a special they've been running since Sabonis was on the team and Karis LeVert. And I do not think that they thought the Celtics were going to be in zone on that possession. They ran it, and since that game, they've run that as a zone buster. for the reason that you're saying. So continue.
Interesting. Yeah. I wonder how often the Pacers, because they have been the best offense in the playoffs. That's as much as we've seen them struggle at some things, they still have scored the ball. No matter what, they're going to score the ball. I wonder how much the weird strong amoebic style of the Celtics will get them to break away from scheme a little bit more often. And because, like, credit to the Pacers, in scheme, they did a lot of good things. Out of their traditional scheme, they did a lot of good things lately to scoring the ball. That adaptability, which is why in the piece I wrote, I said they may not have played the best versions of the teams they played, but they look the best they have so far in the playoffs. Like, they've gained steam in the playoffs,
for sure,
which helps set the stage against a very, very good Celtics team. So, yeah, I really do wonder. I wonder how TJ is able to help change the fabric of these matchups, as you said, like going out of what he's expected to do, gnashing with the left hand, turning it around, going up in the air to battle with Porzingis and like making sure he beats him to the glass. Not every, matchups aren't won by one play, but matchups are won one play at a time. So this kind of stuff, it should be fantastical. Kind of, I feel, the same thing with the Knicks series is like, I just got to see it. Really, I do.
Yeah. Would you like to flip to the other side of the ball and take a look at what the Celtics have attempted to do against Tyrese?
Yes, of course.
Or do you have any thoughts about what you think they might have done against Tyrese?
Well,
before I show you.
Wait, so since I haven't seen as many games, I've seen one of 5. You've seen all 5. Should I be expecting? Wait, were they effective?
The in-season tournament game, they were doing a lot of the cross-matching, and I wrote a piece when Tyrese made the big dagger at the end of the game where it's not super applicable right now, but it was because Buddy had set that ghost screen, and Al Horford actually released, and they got that switch pocket, and Jaylen Brown fouled him for that 4-point play. They started that possession with Jrue Holiday guarding Miles Turner, and the action that the Pacers ran was to completely remove that in order to get Al Horford back onto Miles, in order to get Miles switched on to Tyrese so that Buddy could go set that ghost screen. Like, it was a lot of trying to sow indecision with the cross matches. After the in-season tournament, it was much more hyper-focused on Tyrese's skill set with the ways in which they were defending him, if that makes sense.
That's what I was wondering, whether it's what defenders you're putting on him or whether it's what we're trying to do, because Milwaukee was really like what we're trying to do. And then I guess to some degree, the New York Knicks was a little bit of a mix of both.
Mm-hmm.
Did they weak him a lot? Are we seeing?
I'll go ahead and throw it up there. So this possession you and I actually watched. Yeah. This is the possession that you and I actually watched when you came over and helped me preview what impact Pascal Siakam might have after the trade. Mm-hmm. So you'll see the Jrue Holiday's guarding Tyrese clear out of the logo. When Jrue was matched up with Tyrese, which won't be as often now because Pascal is on the team, and I do expect that Jrue will start out guarding Pascal, but very heavy face guarding like what we were seeing from Deuce McBride at the end of the Knicks series. And you and I kind of talked about like how might this change when Pascal's out on the floor if they're playing 4-on-4 versus what Benedict Matherin's doing here and getting to that floater off of the screen from Isaiah Jackson, and you had good thoughts on that. Otherwise, they started the game at the beginning of January with Derek White guarding Tyrese, and this is what I expect they will do. So on all middle pick and rolls, they weaked Tyrese heavily, forced him left as much as possible, and then the reason why you do this, which you're about ready to see, is other teams have weak Tyrese in the playoffs. I don't think other teams have the quality of defenders that the Boston Celtics have. Even if Porzingis isn't out there, like Al Horford, something very subtle that he does is a lot of times we do think about him switching out to the ball, which he will likely do a fair amount of in this series, but he's very good at, like, if you imagine a fencer stabbing at the ball in drop coverage.
Riposte.
Right. So like right there, he gets Tyrese to have to gather and pull the ball back into Derek White in that drop coverage. And because they weaked him left, it's the dominant hand contest on Tyrese's floater. It ends up being a block shot. Like, that's really pristine pick and roll coverage. So then in the next game, which was a couple days later, the thing that stood out is you'll notice that the Pacers are orienting a lot of their offense intentionally for Tyrese to go to his left hand. So setting the go screen to try to get a little bit of delay against Derek White, and then setting the ball screen for Tyrese to go to his left. Tyrese, a master of reading the corners and taggers, gets it to Aaron Nesmith for that three. So just so that people know, to provide some numbers on that, that's very different than even what we were just seeing against Patrick Beverley was weaking Tyrese to his left. Deuce McBride was weaking Tyrese to his left. That's not necessarily new. During the regular season, the Pacers ran screens for Tyrese to attack to his left on 19 screens per 100 possessions. During the playoffs, that's been up to 26.9. And these 5 regular season games against Boston, they ran screens for him to go to his left on 34 picks per 100 possessions. Like, that's them really reorienting their offense because they know what the quality of Boston's defense is. Like, we're going to have to do this in a way that isn't as natural to what we do, but we value Tyrese having the screen and at least being able to get downhill off a pick versus having no screen at all, if that makes sense.
Right. So the expectation on the one end of 4 is like, if Siakam does well, you get to affect Jason Tatum's volume a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Adversely, on the other side of the floor, what do you think the Pacers have to do to guarantee that Tyrese gets his volume?
Well, like I said, they're going to run more of it for him to get to his left in general. The other impact that you saw from that is he started that game 0 of 4 in the first quarter, and he was 1 of 6 by halftime. And it wasn't just their defense. It's because another thing that Boston did that you now saw the Knicks do with Deuce McBride is they attacked Tyrese relentlessly on defense with Tatum and Brown, and not just with Tatum and Brown calling him into screening actions, but with off-ball screening actions with Tatum and Brown as well. So it's almost, it kind of goes back to what I said in Game 6 with Deuce McBride. You almost have to work around what is Tyrese having to do defensively so that he can do more offensively. And if he can't do more offensively, then proactively be looking more for Pascal, because that's what you're going to have to do.
This is kind of what I was thinking about coming into this, is that like, this is a stamina series for Tyrese. And I know nobody, for some reason, nobody gave, nobody cared that he played with back spasms and clearly did something to his ankle. There was no conversation about Warrior
I wrote a whole
Tyrese.
article about it, but hey, somebody cared.
Yeah, well, you know what I mean, though, right? Like, the larger conversation did not factor in, like, there's no Warrior.
You mean we
Tyrese.
talked a lot more about Jalen Brunson's playing through his foot than we did about the fact that Tyrese would normally show on every pick, and in Game 1, he was a 6'5" guard playing in drop coverage, and nobody cared?
Basically, yeah. So, this is a stamina series, and credit to Tyrese. There was good stuff on ball in Game 7, but getting rid of the ball at the hash mark on the right side, sprinting to the other hash mark, beating guys off ball to weaponize his shooting. The Pacers can always do stuff to kind of like create structure. You know, you talked about how the Knicks allow Jalen Brunson to use the rest of the team as a jungle gym to weave and kind of find his way through. The Pacers can always do that, but a lot of it is like Tyrese. If you're healthy, or if you're feeling good enough that you can shoot, you're one of the best shooters in the world. There has to be a bit of Curry in there. You have to weaponize yourself off ball. So having the stamina to take the beatings on the one side of the ball, which he will, the Celtics are going to target him, and still like stay on ball, probe, work to stay on ball, go to the mid-range jump shot the way that you did against the Knicks. And when you're off ball, even if it might not end up in your hands, sprinting, cutting, like giving yourself to every offensive possession. It's not easy, but for the Pacers to come in, and they'll be stealing games. This Celtics team is really good. For them to come in and steal games, they're going to need stamina, endless amounts of it from Tyrese. So God bless. I wonder how much he's able to bring.
And another element of this is because in that game at the end of January when Pascal was available, Buddy was still on the team and Buddy was starting. TJ didn't play in that game, so Andrew was the backup point guard. Andrew wasn't playing alongside Tyrese, and they ended up finishing the game with Andrew at point because Tyrese didn't play in the fourth quarter. Is we might see again that Andrew's initiating more of the offense because of the things that you just laid out. And in that regard, it goes back to what you and I talked about with the Tyrese Pascal two-man game conversation, that it's very important for Tyrese to continue being as physical as he is as a screener as well, and being willing to create those advantages that way, because that's another way that he can spring himself free. Ultimately, I don't want them to tilt that too far in that direction because obviously you're in the Eastern Conference Finals. Your all-star player, your max level player is one of the best pick and roll creators in the NBA. I don't want that much of the offense to be run through Andrew, but that is one way that he can get himself free with the off-ball movement in that Curry way that you're referring to.
Yeah. And like the Pacers, this is where they win games. Like, there's problems. The Celtics are good, but the Pacers score the ball. Andrew, despite some people lamenting how much time the ball spends in his hands, he's like 66% true shooting. Mm-hmm. He's been unbelievable. Brunson wasn't his matchup. We previewed it and we said Brunson isn't his matchup. He's been unbelievable in the playoffs relative to expectation, I think. Pascal, a little less volume than some people may have expected. Some games less efficacy. But the Pacers have been able to mix in different looks and find success. I think that their counters will work against the Celtics. I think Pascal will draw some doubles. I think that they'll be able to create open looks out of it. I think he'll score in isolation sometimes. I think that Nembhard will knife middle, get to his shot. I think that he'll create looks to the corners and to the dunker spot on occasion. But the offense, the agrarian economy of buckets, is built out of Tyrese Haliburton actions, and they have to be diligent in finding their way to them.
Would you allow me an aside that really doesn't have that much to do with this matchup, but it's something that I noticed about Andrew Nembhard in this matchup that I'd be curious to know how you would operate with? So when you're playing or when you were playing competitively, did you play out of handoffs that often?
No, live ball.
Okay. So you wouldn't have been like coming up out of the corner and playing out of a handoff?
No, I did mostly everything above the break.
Okay. I was just curious to know that if you would have been coming out of the weak hand corner, so the right corner for you, and you came out of a handoff, which hand would you put the ball on the floor with first when you got the handoff? Your left or your right?
My right.
You'd take an inside dribble.
Yeah, so I always like the on handoffs, you like to get downhill, and basically, so what you do is you can, because teams load up, so you do a throw ahead with your right hand, and then you stab your right foot forward, and it's like that dead leg cross, and then you snatch it back with your left, and then that freezes the big, and it also puts the guy guarding you in a really tough position because a dead leg cross is not really what people are expecting, and then it typically creates a lane for a roll. Because everyone freezes because it's not a typical action of like a handoff or something like that. If it was a handoff, you do that throw ahead. It mimics a snake. Nobody really knows which lane they're guarding, and then you flatten out and then you can do a push or throw ahead dribble into the space available. This is maybe a bit too self-indulgent, but anyway.
No. The reason I brought it up is because that's exactly what Andrew did. Andrew doesn't play a ton out of handoffs, but he was in the left corner coming off of it, and that's what he did. He used a throw-ahead dribble with his inside hand, so his left hand, to square himself much quicker and was able to get into the middle of the defense. I haven't seen anybody with the Pacers do that, and I haven't seen him do it. So I was like, that's pretty curious because it allowed him to get and square so much faster than if he took – otherwise, you'd have to take two dribbles with your right. Like, you'd have to take one initial dribble and then another dribble to square yourself and get there, and it allows the defense to catch up. He threw it pretty far out into space with his inside hand, then crossed right to the right and was able to get into the middle of the defense, but I didn't know this was such I haven't seen a lot of people doing this actively. I think maybe I've seen Duncan Robinson do that with some handoffs that he plays out of with Bam, but like nobody else on the Pacers really does that. That was the first time I'd seen Andrew do it, but you already laid it out and described it before I said it. So
he's great. He's such a nifty guard. So yeah, big fan.
But anyways, back to the Tyrese conversation. Do you want to look at what the Celtics were doing at the other end of the floor to kind of target him in the first quarter of some of the games in January? I can get your opinion on what you thought of how they guarded some of those off-ball actions. The Celtics like to run quite a bit of horns, and it's basically just like horns chin a lot of the time. They were targeting Ben and Tyrese with their two defenders at the opposite elbow with the big as a trigger man on 3 possessions in a row, where you could tell that Ben thought he was supposed to stay home on Jason Tatum, and Tyrese thought they were going to be switching these cuts, which goes back to the conversations that you and I have had many times, that these aren't really cuts that you should be getting beat on. These are intermediary actions that are supposed to cause one defender to sag so that when the other goes to get the handoff, you're slightly delayed behind the handoff. You shouldn't be getting beat on the first action, but they're going to get beat repeatedly on this first action. So Jalen Smith comes all the way over then to tag. Derek White is the cutter. Benedict Matherin's not in a position to be able to get back out to the corner. That's the first time. The next trip down the floor, exact same play again, was staying home. So then Derek White just fades and they're able to get that three-pointer off. Same exact play again between the screening action. This time they do readily switch it and Benedict Matherin takes the cutaway. But then it's like, oh yeah, this is why we're not switching it, because Tyrese has no hope of staying in front of Jason Tatum, which maybe you're willing to live with Al Horford driving kick three. But the point being is Tyrese isn't going to stay in front of Jason Tatum.
Yeah, I thought that's a bad play from Jason Tatum, actually.
Making the kick.
He didn't have to be out of control the way that he was. That's like, I wonder, that play right there, it isn't necessarily good process, but that's good outcome, I think. That's where I wonder Tatum to be like a champion. Some of that playmaking in the middle, some of that like adaptability, I
think that his processing over the last roughly year and a half has gotten better at locating kick out avenues quicker than what you would have seen in the final series against Golden State. But I do see your point that there's times where it's...
Yeah. Could you imagine if he had taken an extra dribble and like taken that to 2 feet? Just like infinitely better.
Do you want me to roll it again?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's Benedict Matherin as the secondary rim protector in this situation. So yeah, it's not the best decision to be kicking it, period, regardless of how he goes off or what finish he's going to use. But my larger point is that Tyrese isn't going to contain Jason Tatum on a switch. But then you go into the end, this last possession before halftime, very similar. You're going to see that Tyrese is actually going to motion and tell Jalen Smith, like, hey, pre-switch this on the approach so that I'm not going to be targeted by Jason Tatum, but Jalen doesn't go. So Tyrese ends up there. They're going to look like they're going to run that same horns chin action again, but they don't, because Jason wants to get Tyrese. So they use that little screen, and then Tyrese gets beat. And this was actually the first time where I was like, oh, here, this is something. So when he gets beat, he peels and is able to snag that pass. So let me show this one too. Another hack that they found in the second half against that same play. Drew being able to get Tyrese on that switch. They switch that one again. Obi Toppin being opportunistic to be like, hey, I'll get you off of that matchup. Obviously he jumps, and that's not exactly what you want. But the Pacers as a whole are going to have to be like Tyrese motioning to Jalen Smith, like, hey, you need to pre-switch into this. Hey, Obi Toppin, you need to scram me out of this. They're going to have to be very cognizant of a lot of the off-ball switching with Tyrese, because I think that is valid in what he's going to be able to do offensively. But in the in-season tournament, the Pacers changed up their pick-and-roll coverages quite a lot, and afterwards, Rick's like, well, we changed our pick-and-roll coverage just before halftime and after halftime to something we had never done before, but I give our guys a lot of credit. And when he got pressed and asked, like, well, what was the pick-and-roll coverage, he wouldn't say. Like, they acted like it was top secret. So this is from the video that I made that was called Caitlin Confidential, because apparently, like, we couldn't go back and watch the pick and roll coverages and see what they did, but they were switching on all pick and rolls. And then instead of trying to recover back in front of that switch, they were automatically having Andrew sprint to the corner. And it's effectively a low man pick and roll switch. So the low man's always going to switch off of the person that's slipping the screen, or if they do get a slip against a switch, and that person's then going to peel to the opposite corner. So they did that the entire second half of the in-season tournament, and that was the first game that they did it in. And now they've continued doing that more with Tyrese than the ones that I've shown you.
Interesting. Hopefully less of those the Jalen faux pas of like, you got to go get this one. That's good though. It's interesting that was the play that ended up bearing fruit for your idea, but like, oh, more of this.
Of more of the Tyrese peeling instead of pursuing.
Mm-hmm.
Question. Another philosophical question. Just your overall opinion on peel switching. Do you think that a peel switch scheme leads to complacency defending on ball, or that it could?
No. Like, I know there's people who disagree. I know there's very intelligent people who disagree. Complacency will show up anywhere.
I agree.
You can be diligent in a peel switch. It's kind of like the zone thing is like, on its face, a lot of people, when they think of zone, they think of men's league. The heater came on again. They think of like men's league. They think of people not being able to do anything, and they think it's like this lazy style of basketball, right? But zone, if done correctly, is like this hyperactive style of basketball where there's a lot going on. And peel switching is like close out properly, proper footwork, maintain angles, show the correct top foot, like all this kind of stuff, and people rotating behind it. Now it's not just about like guard your yard, keeping everything flat, keeping everybody in front of you, but it's like you have to think about the man behind you and work to protect the man behind you. And the person behind that has to operate like 5 on a string. I don't think it makes people complacent.
I think
it could, but I don't know. Ideally,
it could, then I'm not going to blame the peel switch. I guess I'm going to blame the intensity that's being brought behind it, and maybe perhaps even the teaching behind it. Because in some respects, a peel switch, a jump switch should be able to make the on-ball defender more aggressive, because they know if I get beat, somebody's going to be behind me and I can peel off to the perimeter, versus perhaps having to play more conservatively. And I guess my counterpoint to that would be, why wouldn't a late switch make you complacent? Like, if the idea is, well, I'm going to get beat and then I can just trail off to the perimeter and I'm just going to leave that on my teammates, why wouldn't a late switch have the same effect of, well, if I get beat, I can just veer into that big and kind of meander? Mm-hmm. Like, it should be the same thing. Like, if you're willing to do one, then you should be willing to do the other. And in the reverse of that, it's like what you said with the zone. I don't think that playing zone in college made Matisse Thybulle a complacent defender at the NBA level. To me, at a certain point in time, it's the effort and the teaching that's going into whatever your scheme is going to be. And you devise the scheme based on the skill set of the players that you're coaching. And I think for the Pacers' sake, they don't necessarily have enough stout on-ball defenders not to peel. Like, the idea that, well, we want to teach pursue, we want to get back in front of those players. I don't think that they necessarily have players who can do that. And most of the time when they've found hacks or found things that have disrupted other teams, it's because they've gone to those types of wrinkles. Why not? Tyrese's best skill as a defender is his ability to play aerial ace and to move around the perimeter. It's not going to be him being targeted or trying to get back in front of a screener. And this way you're eliminating both things. You're protecting against the mismatch and you're letting him peel back into that potential passing lane. And his instincts there are quite good. So
I fundamentally don't understand also, like, if you're a good team in the NBA and you're playing basketball at the highest level, why your thought process would ever be like, oh, well, I'm peeling, so it's not on me. It's like, well, the team might get scored on. Not only that, but if you peel switch to the corner, the chances are, like, there's a 40% chance that you're going to be involved in an X out in like 0.8 seconds anyways. So, like, you're back in the action. You know what I mean? Like, you can't disengage.
It kind of brings up a whole nother point that if you are playing the guard your yard scheme, and like I said, the Pacers had the lowest closeout rate in the NBA by a wide margin, like incredibly low closeout rate, then are you not creating complacency on the behalf of off-ball defenders?
Yeah.
If you know, like, well, we don't help in these situations.
Yeah.
And so much of the time you could see that I wouldn't even call it complacency, and that's not what I'm trying to equate it to, but a level of confusion. Like, even when Pascal first came over and we were kind of talking about, which I do agree with you, like, you can see a drop off over the years from him and what he does as a secondary rim protector versus how effective he was doing a lot of those things under the Nick Nurse scheme. But you could tell a lot of the times how confused he was. Like, am I supposed to help in this situation? Am I not supposed to help in this situation? Because the scheme was so much different. I mean, I think you could make the argument no matter what the thing is that you're willing to live with or take away, well, that's going to make those specific defenders complacent.
Bad defensive environments always make players worse defensively. Good defensive environments usually make players better defensively. So, yeah.
And I also just think it's kind of natural at times that at any level that, like, peel switching is just kind of something that players naturally do because of the kinetic energy of it.
That's Mike Prada talks about this, yeah? Like, maintaining kinetic energy on the defensive side of the ball, how important that is, and like being able to like boomerang around is, and also this kind of, it's obviously not Mike Prada. I've heard him talk about this. I've had a conversation with him about this, but I don't know who was the first person who was like, maybe closeouts don't have to be like this because you're kind of rounding back into the play. Maybe, that jump stop, chop step, like all that kind of stuff. Maybe that isn't what's best. Maybe we rotate behind the closeout, and maybe the closeout rotates behind that. And it's like a whirling dervish, which complicates passing lanes, which is why I think a lot of guys, and there's a lot of playmakers now or creators now who have a lot of trouble navigating those moving defenses. I mean, we just saw a couple plays where both Jalen and Jason had trouble navigating like the motion that was coming with the Pacers. That's a way to obfuscate passing lanes and driving lanes. And if you do it right, you can cover more ground than it appears that you cover, while also covering the ground that you do cover. I know that sounds like a little bit of like fortune cookie wisdom, but I promise.
No, I think that's a good way to put it. You and I don't normally just look at like numbers and decide what our opinions of basketball are going to be. But in this sake, I think it is somewhat telling between the two teams. The Pacers ranked third in drives per 100 possessions during the regular season, still third in drives per 100 possessions in the playoffs. Boston, 27th in that category, 15th in that category in the playoffs for some of the reasons that you just kind of outlined there. And because of what I was just talking about with what the Pacers scheme has waxed and waned on as far as we keep our off-ball defenders at home and we live somewhat with the on-ball defender having to hold up in the guard your yard scheme. How do you kind of project or see that playing out? Like, do you think that Boston will be more willing to drive against the Pacers because the driving lanes are typically there? Or do you see it as perhaps they could become complacent in relying on threes as often as they already do? If that makes sense.
If things are going bad for the Celtics, they've gotten complacent. Yeah. I think if things are going good for the Celtics, because the Celtics are such a talented team, and this happens with talented teams, is like if we see it with the Pacers offensively. They have a few different things they can go to that works. It's just about mixing and matching, pulling the right toggle at the right time. The Celtics have the ability to drive better than they do,
right,
and at a higher volume. If that's more available against the Pacers, you should be taking it. And especially with the Pacers being a team that will score with the Celtics, leaving yourself to the mercy or the whims or the variance of just 3-point shots, it might be trouble. So if I'm the Celtics, I'm driving more, or at least I hope to. And I'm putting the Pacers in a position where it's like, are you going to be in motion? Are you going to meet me there? I think that's probably, the Pacers just played a Knicks team that shot the hell out of the basketball. They kept shooting. Like Dante DiVincenzo hit 9 threes in Game 7. Before Game 7 in the playoffs, every single Knick except Jalen Brunson shot 40% from 3. The Knicks shot the hell out of the basketball. You can't you have to stop the Pacers on one end, yes, but trying to shoot with them when you probably have Jason Tatum getting to the rim as a fulcrum of a portion of your offense, I would want that for sure.
Yeah, because obviously this is what leads to the wild swings for Boston because they are so willing to lean into high volume 3-point shooting. The Pacers had a historic loss to the Celtics in November when Tyrese did not play and they scored over 150 points. The Pacers only made 5 threes in that game. I think that those are both somewhat outliers for both teams that didn't necessarily play out in the other matchups. But the ability to pierce the Pacers' defense is there. The defense has gotten better since when these games were played. And I just find it interesting because they averaged 40 drives per 100 possessions, Boston did, ranking 27th in the NBA. And in these 5 games against the Pacers, that inched up to 44 drives per 100 possessions, which is still not a very high mark. So they still leaned into taking the threes despite the fact that the Pacers stay home on the 3-point line.
Interesting. We'll see.
But yeah. So that was mainly the things that broad strokes, nitty gritty, philosophical talking points about inside hands on handoffs and feel switching that I was going to cover here, unless you have other things that you've thought about in this matchup that you wanted to ask me or things that you've noticed or wanted to say.
No, I'm happy. I'm happy with where that's at. I'm excited to see these two teams go at it. I expect the Pacers to hang in better than most people think. I don't think we're seeing the Pacers in the finals. I think the Celtics are probably in the finals. But I also thought that about the Knicks. And like OG getting injured is a big, big deal. But the Pacers, they've been able to work magic given who they've played. So we'll see.
I will say that headed out of those 2 games against that Knicks series, obviously very unfortunate that the entire Knicks roster was basically crumbling to bits by the end of that game. This is the first time that Pascal Siakam has played with Tyrese Haliburton and who Tyrese Haliburton is capable of being.
Yeah, that's meaningful.
So
we've gotten 4 or 5 games like that where you're like, okay, it's here. And game 7, it was there, especially the start.
And regardless of the outcome, I like watching the Celtics play quite a lot, probably more than you do, especially defensively. And I think that all of these games, we're going to get multiple games within a game. And I really look forward to covering that. All 5 of these games were a pleasure for me to watch and rewatch because I noticed things that I didn't notice the first time that I saw it. Mm-hmm. And how many different machinations and different forms that the games took on from. So
I love middle of the court chess players. The Celtics have none of them. And they're one of the best teams in all of the NBA. Maybe at the end of the year, we say that they're the best team, but they don't have middle of the court chess players, which is the type of player I enjoy most, that's all I mean to say when I'm like, I love guys who solve from the middle. Yeah.
But anyways, glad that you're willing to continue staying on here and talking with me about this Pacer team, and hopefully we get to do it continuing to watch good basketball.
Fingers are crossed.
But that's where I'll leave it. So we'll be back talking to you after game 1.